Yep.
Okay, everyone, welcome. Thank you for coming back after lunch. You're in the Analyzing Models short paper session. I hope that's where you mean to be. The first talk will be a neural model of adaptation in reading, and Marten is our speaker.
Hi. So I'd like to start with a thought experiment. So let's say that you are at a conference. Imagine this. And as you're talking to somebody, they say, throughout your conversation, they say the word cassowary. And then as you're first surprised, because this is seemingly irrelevant to EMNLP, but then as you're continuing to talk to them, throughout the conversation, they use this word, cassowary, cassowary, cassowary. And by the end of your talk, by the end of your conversation, you're probably less surprised to hear them use this word, which suggests that you've kind of adapted to their lexical choices. Maybe they're Michael Elsner. And so now you sort of, you're less surprised by this person using cassowary, so you've adapted to the lexical choices. Let's go to another setting. Fein and Jaeger in 2016 ran a psycholinguistic reading time experiment where they wanted to see if people adapt similarly to syntax. So I'm going to show you a sentence here, word by word, and then we'll talk about it. So most people, when they read the sentence, they get confused about the word conducted because they initially interpret the sentence to be saying the soldiers warned about the dangers, period. And so the sentence is actually the soldiers who were warned about the dangers conducted the raid. But the who were is optional, and so you can remove it. And what they found in their study was that people initially are surprised by this construction because it's very rare. But by the end of the experiment, subjects were less surprised, which shows that humans adapt to syntactic structure even when there's no lexical cue, right? The reduced relative clause is marked by an explicit lack of a cue. So this is nice. Humans can adapt to lexical choices, to syntactic choices very easily. So let's go to NLP now. In NLP, we're very interested in domain adaptation. There's a lot of work on that here. But what I'm going to propose here is that we can use human adaptive behavior as a benchmark for our adaptive computational models to kind of evaluate how well are they adapting, because we know humans are good at this task. So the model I'm going to be proposing is frustratingly simple. It is just an off-the-shelf LSTM language model trained on English Wikipedia, and the adaptation algorithm I'm going to use is to test this model on a sentence, then update the weights based on the loss of that sentence, and continue. So you're basically just getting incrementally more and more of your new domain as you're processing the experiment or whatever your task. So the first evaluation you could do for this kind of model is to ask, does it improve accuracy? I think this is kind of the standard thing people do in NLP. If I adapt to a new domain, am I more accurate in that domain? So I took the natural stories corpus, which is 10 documents. 7 of them are fairy tales, 3 of them are documentaries. And let's focus here just on the left box for the moment. So the y-axis here is perplexity, so lower is better. The purple bar is the non-adaptive model, and the pink bar is the model with adaptation. And we see that over the course of this corpus, adaptation helps you. And if we go into the right box here, we can see that gain is mostly from the fairy tale genre, right? Because fairy tales are unlike Wikipedia. But we also see that even in the documentary genre, you get some advantage from using adaptation. Okay, so this is kind of your standard evaluation you would do. But what you can also do, and what I'm talking about here, is can we evaluate against human behavior? So how can we do this? Well, we can look at reading times. We know surprisal predicts reading times very well. And surprisal is just the negative log probability of a word given the preceding context. And so what we can do is we can look at a couple things. We could look at the timeline of adaptation in the model, and we can also look at if adaptive surprisal predicts reading times better than non-adaptive surprisal. So first, let's look at the timeline evaluation. This is a more subjective evaluation. But so let's take the Fein and Jaeger example I gave earlier of reduced relative clause. So you see sentences like, the soldiers warned about the dangers conducted the raid. How surprised are you over the course of the experiment? So on the left here, I have the human results of how surprised the humans are over the course of seeing, so the x-axis here is the number of these strange sentences they've seen. So as they see more and more of these, they become less and less surprised, with this kind of sharper decline in surprise, followed by kind of a more gradual decline. And this is true also of the adaptive model measured in surprisal. But this sort of evaluation is kind of hand-wavy because it's subjective, right? We're just sort of saying, look, the sort of curve of adaptation seems similar across these things. We can also look more quantitatively. So here what we're showing is the predictive power of each of these predictors, so sentence position, word length, surprisal, at predicting reading times. So the y-axis here is how many milliseconds of reading time you get for each additional increase in this predictor. So for word length, each additional character buys you 7.5 more milliseconds of reading time. And we see that surprisal, non-adaptive surprisal, for each bit of non-adaptive surprisal, you get an additional 7 milliseconds of reading time. We see that if we add adaptive surprisal into this model, now non-adaptive surprisal isn't that useful. It doesn't predict that many milliseconds of reading time, but adaptive surprisal predicts even more than non-adaptive surprisal did in the first place. So we can see that this adaptation is producing a model whose behavior corresponds more closely to that of humans than the original model. The other thing we can do, instead of just using the human behavioral output as a kind of benchmark, is we can adopt methodologies from psycholinguistics to kind of probe our models. So this is kind of in line with the black box NLP workshop earlier. So you can say, is the model adapting to vocabulary or is it adapting to syntax? So for this, I generated some dative sentence pairs. So these are sentences that have like the boy threw the dog the ball. And you can construct that either with a double object construction, the boy threw the dog the ball, or a prepositional object construction, the boy threw the ball to the dog. And these have the same lexical items and the same kind of meaning, but they have different syntactic structure. So this is kind of a graphical representation of the evaluation. So what I did was I shuffled several of these double object sentences in with 1,000 Wikipedia kind of fillers. And then you adapt the pre-trained model to that set, freeze the weights, and then you ask, now that you've seen a distribution that's kind of skewed towards double object, how well do you predict other double object sentences with different vocabulary items, like the captain mailed the student a letter, versus other prepositional object sentences, so different syntactic construction but the same vocabulary items. So you can see how well the model's adapting to each of these types of linguistic signal. So here we see, this is again the results for a model that's adapted to double objects. We did correspondingly also prepositional objects. That model predicts prepositional object sentences, so these are items that have the same vocabulary but different syntax. Adaptation helps quite a bit in that case. And we see in the case of double object test sentences that have different vocabulary items but the same syntax, the adaptation helps quite a bit. So this is nice, it's adapting to both. If you had more models, you could say one is adapting more to syntax than the other, or more vocabulary than the other. Yeah, this is kind of just the proof of concept for how you might do this sort of thing. So in conclusion, I proposed a simple adaptation mechanism which is more accurate than a non-adaptive model, and it makes more human-like predictions than a non-adaptive model. Also in the paper and in questions I can talk about, I show that it's not that dependent on learning rate. It's pretty robust across different learning rates, and it does not suffer from catastrophic forgetting. But I think the more important contribution of this work is to propose new ways of evaluating adaptation. So you can use human adaptive behavior as kind of a benchmark for how to evaluate your model's adaptation. And you can also use methodologies from psycholinguistics, which are used to probing which were developed for probing a black box, namely the human brain, to probe these NLP black box models. Thank you. And I guess before questions, really quick, I will mention that my PI, Tal Linzen, is hiring a postdoc, so if you're interested in this kind of work.
Awesome. We have time for questions. Please come up to one of the microphones or come to me and I'll hand you the one that I have.
Hi, so you were, good talk.
Thank you.
I am Tucker Curvin, I'm from Google Seattle. You're updating the whole model, correct?
Yeah.
Did you experiment with doing just updates on only certain parts of the model?
I didn't know, but that's something I'm also interested in. Like some models that, for example, will freeze all but like the input embedding or something like this. And then, yeah, you might be able to see how well you can get in terms of like, if I see something that's similar to something that's in the adaptation set, I get some benefit from adapting, but I don't lose anything from the,
Okay.
yeah.
Did you do any analysis of where the most updates were coming from, or the largest?
No, so these are all just kind of on the output. So I'm not doing any kind of internal.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions? Okay, I realize I forgot to introduce myself at the start of the session. I'm Luke Settlemware. I'm at the University of Washington and also at Facebook. And I have a question about domain effects versus sort of syntactic effects, right?
Yep.
So I think you were training on Wikipedia and then testing on another domain,
Yep.
which should cause some surprisal by itself.
Yep.
And then also varying the syntax. And so, you know, do you think it was controlled, the sort of two factors? Could you tease them apart? Or I'm sure the details are in the paper, but how did that go?
Sorry, so what do you mean you're adapting to no domain?
So like if you trained on, you know, say biomed and then tested on a novel, you would see presumably more surprisal just from that, let alone sort of the indirect objects versus the direct objects.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the kind of vocabulary versus syntax evaluation got at this a little bit. So when you're adapting to, say, fairy tales, even if they're I don't know, say you read Wikipedia on the Tulip Mania, and then you read a fairy tale about Tulip Mania, it'll have similar vocabulary items, but it's going to have different syntax just because of the genre. So the syntactic distribution is going to be corresponding to the domain. And so if you can adapt to a syntactic distribution, I think that's kind of, like that's really the difference between domains, right, is the difference between vocabulary choice and syntax. So
Makes sense. Time for one other quick question? Okay, I'll ask a generic one.
Right.
Do you think a different architecture would have a different effect?
I mean, yeah, I think that, yeah, I mean, the profile of these adaptation effects are different depending on your parameterization. So a different model is going to adapt differently, but then you can use these methods to sort of probe, yeah, how different is it, and in what ways is it different?
Thank you very much.